Hello, and welcome to this short episode, mini thing of Complete Terminator. Needs milk. Anywho, I've been trying to do this for a while. This started my brain rolling by watching the other day. It came on the 2018 Romp Game Night, which I really enjoyed. Particularly noticed that there's a scene, I forget entirely why, I can't really remember the context, but there's like a underground fight club for rich people in a mansion, and the heroes of the film are trying to get something out of a safe from the mansion, being distracted by the fact that, well, everyone's distracted by the fact they're all looking at this fight. Manages to get to the safe, gets the thing out of the safe just as someone is knocked down in front of him, and therefore everyone's eyes are on him, wondering what he's doing. And to fit in with this group of wealthy industrialists, he says that he is the CEO of Cyberdyne Systems. They realise that they're lying, and I think a chase ensues. And of course, they figured he's not actually the CEO of Cyberdyne Systems because it is a fictional company, although there is one in Japan. But yeah, it did get me thinking though, who, if feasible, would have been the CEO of Cyberdyne Systems in 2018 when the film came out? Let's have a look. So first off, Terminator timelines, which are a slightly tricky thing, and my view of Terminator timelines might be a little different to some people, so bear that in mind. Obviously, my view on it is that Terminator T2, T3, Salvation all form one, not quite a loop, a line. And although the war ahead might be changing, these characters are constant. So John in Salvation would remember things that happened to John in Terminator 2. So there's a line there of consistency. Obviously, Dark Fate has come along and proclaimed itself sequel of T2, which is fine. I don't personally believe that, and it makes it easier for me to kind of organise it in my head. But there we are. So so that's where we are with the first four films. Obviously, if you look at Judgment Day that's touted for the first two, at least before the events of Terminator 2, we have August 29th, 1997. And therefore, if Judgment Day is happening in 1997, we obviously have no civilized society in 2018, let alone fully functioning Cyberdyne Systems or a CEO to run it. So no, there's nothing there in as far as the war we see in those instances. And then obviously if we follow Terminator 2, Cyberdyne Systems is destroyed in 1995. So again, no Cyberdyne in 2018. This does push the war back somewhat. And then of course we have the US military forming CRS, Cyber Research Systems, taking on the assets of Cyberdyne and doing their own research with them. Even so, that means that Cyberdyne obviously ceases to exist. We remember the deleted Candy scene where he says, Cyberdyne, that's ancient history. Very miserable looking man. But there we are. Cyberdyne is ancient history in 2004. And then we have Judgment Day anyway, 14 years before 2018. So certainly no CEO. And then after that, of course, we have Salvation, which is set in 2018. So if you want real proof in that timeline of what is happening with Cyberdyne in 2018, watch Salvation. Absolutely nothing. That being said, the Cyberdyne logo is used in some instances by Skynet, possibly because it's just sitting somewhere as a patent on a database and they've decided to use it. So there's a little bit, but a little bit of a logo does not a CEO make. So in as far as those films go, absolutely no. In all of those films, the war is raging on in 2018, and certainly there is no Cyberdyne. Onwards. And then we come to Terminator Genesis. Not Salvation. I don't actually own a Genesis poster. Anyway, so Genesis, as I said before, is kind of isolated a little bit. It doesn't follow on from any other films. It isn't followed by any other films, unfortunately. It just kind of sits there referencing particularly the first two films, and then it sort of gets its legs cut off, unfortunately. So it is kind of isolated, and is probably the closest we get to a 2018 fully functioning Cyberdyne system. We actually get two versions of 2017 in Genesis. We have the kind of war-torn future when we see it where we're introduced to John and Kyle, and then we have the kind of alternate version where Sarah and Kyle arrive and meet up with Pops. And this is really where we come closest, because we have a fully functioning Cyberdyne systems waiting to be destroyed. Who is CEO of Cyberdyne in 2017? It is Miles Dyson, finally getting the top job in the company. So yeah, so that's really cool. Dyson is really close. Of course, Cyberdyne is destroyed, and because we don't get a proper follow-up, it's difficult to know what happens afterwards. Obviously, we get the post-credit sequence with Genesis Skynet still being online. But what does that mean? Does that mean that things carry on for a bit? Is Cyberdyne able to be salvaged in the wreckage? Is it still carrying on with Dyson as CEO? It's unclear. Bear in mind that if we hadn't have had interference, possibly, if we hadn't have had Sarah and Reese, maybe even John going to 2017, Cyberdyne might have continued on for years to come. Who knows? Bear in mind that Sarah wanted to go to 1997 and Reese talked her out of it. So if he hadn't been able to, if she'd been a bit more stubborn, would they have ended up in 1997, and would that have affected 2017 Cyberdyne? Who knows? But it definitely comes the closest to 2018 Cyberdyne. Just 1 year out. Dyson, good man. And then we come to Dark Fate. I've said before, I don't personally believe that Dark Fate is a direct sequel to our Terminator 2, but sequel to events that are similar. So Cyberdyne is still destroyed, and therefore it's quite easy to look at Cyberdyne here, because just like what T3 does, Cyberdyne is destroyed in 1995, and someone else gets either the assets or does something else similar. So obviously in Dark Fate we have Legion, which seems to be a government program, and Cyberdyne is gone. So just like Terminator 3, we have absolutely no Cyberdyne after 1995, which is nice and easy. And cold. So we mustn't also forget that we have Sarah Connor Chronicles, but they follow the T2 line. The fact that Cyberdyne is destroyed in 1995, and that's it. We get a brand new source for the war, which is the Turk. And even though we get closer to 2018, the war still happens in 2011. So society ends 7 years before 2018. So we have no reference to Cyberdyne. It's all destroyed as of 1995, and then we get the war years before anyway. So no in SEC. Sorry. And then of course we have Terminator 2 3D, which is probably the most Cyberdyne-centric entries into the live-action series post T2. It still leans very heavily on Cyberdyne as a name of recognition, because it's a theme park attraction. So we're very much built on that idea. Is it canon? No. But obviously they say, well, people know Cyberdyne, will base it on that. So in T2 3D, they just rebuild. Nothing happens, all is well, the war is averted somehow, and they carry on. So obviously in all three theme parks where Terminator 2 3D operated, it was built as Cyberdyne systems. Notably, Japan built an absolutely massive Cyberdyne frontage compared to Florida and Hollywood, which were relatively small frontages. But it was built obviously as Cyberdyne. Boom. And there were lots of references to characters that we know. Dr. Silverman now, for some reason, is working there. Much the same idea. People know him, will get him in, but he's working there, I think, as like a staff liaison and well-being and etc. And also, Moshe, who's the guard at Cyberdyne in Terminator 2, is actually given a name here. He's called Grayson Hunter, which is pretty cool. I'll take that again. Canon. The one character that is notably missing is the CEO. We don't find out who he is. I think there was probably an opportunity there to say, oh, here he is, the CEO, but they don't do it. Possibly because we never even look at the CEO in the usual canon of the series, so they decided not to and devote the time to other things. So who would have been the CEO? This brings me to the point that we don't know when Terminator 2 3D is set. It was released in 1996, but the film was set in 95, so we're to assume it's just a year between the two. This presents some issues because one, it implies the company rebuilt to this massive operation within 1 year, but more pressingly it means that certain characters have obviously aged more than a year. But bear in mind it was 5 years between T2 and T2 3D. Most obviously John. John is now not 11 years old. He's not even 14 years old, if you bear in mind that he was 13 when he was shooting T2. So that doesn't really make any sense. If it is 96, then feasibly it's the same CEO, potentially, which I will touch on in a sec. But some things don't make sense. If you're looking at it as when would it be set definitively, I looked at this years ago. I was trying to figure this out. And I looked at when Edward Furlong, how old he was when he filmed T2 3D, and I'm sure he was 18, I think. So I thought, well, maybe it's when John Connor would be 18, as John is a little younger than Edward Furlong, and he was 18 in 2003, pretty much when Terminator 3 was set. So it could be set in 2003. But if it's set in 2003, would it still be the same guy running the company 8 years later? There's a reference in the Terminator 2 novel to him being ill. So there's a reference in this by Frakes, I think, to him being ill or looking ill. One moment. Talk among yourselves. There's a reference to I Love Lucy. Lucille Ball. Arnold was in a Lucille Ball film, Happy Anniversary and Goodbye in 1974. Amazing. Okay, sorry, I've never noticed that before. Here we go. Okay, so this is the description, and we'll touch on who he is and whatnot in a minute. But it says here, the owner and CEO of Cyberdyne strode into the large glass and steel office. He had not aged gracefully in the 10 years since he'd founded the company. Beating off competitors and struggling to maintain control over the other board members, he was only 51, but he looked a decade older. His once thick shock of dark hair turned thin and grey. Liver spots dotted his pale skin, and he walked with a slight limp from arthritis in his hip. Okay. So Randall Frakes, with his next line, completely kills my idea that the CEO would be dead by 2003, in that he says he would live a lot longer and become a lot wealthier before he died, but you wouldn't know it to look at him. So, according to Frakes, potentially, the CEO at the time of Terminator 2 could still have been the CEO of Cyberdyne in 2003 or whenever Terminator 2 3D is set, which is interesting. Or it would be, were it not for the case that, regardless of that, there is no way that T2 3D takes place in 2018. It's just far too far in the future. The characters don't match up with what that would look like. It doesn't make any sense. Bear in mind that's over 20 years after the ride came out, so no. What it's saying in terms of what happens afterwards, in terms of the war, it doesn't really. So we're still no closer. And even if Cyberdyne were still about in 2018 in that timeline, who knows who the CEO would be. But it's pretty cool. I Love Lucy. It's cold, so I've had to put the heater on. One other thing I will say, which I don't know if it's entirely relevant, is the idea of the original timeline. Ooh. Was there one? Who knows? Some people think that what we're seeing in the first film is the loop and that's it. I think that there was a timeline where Cyberdyne created Skynet off its own back. Reese mentions in the Sarah Fights Back deleted scene molecular memory. We don't know anything about this, but it suggests at some point that Cyberdyne was responsible for Skynet completely by itself. So this bears an interesting point in that if you look at Genesis, they completely skip over Terminator 2, they skip over the idea of the CPU and ARM being left at Cyberdyne, and we arrive in 2017 to see Cyberdyne is functioning and Skynet is sort of on its way, which possibly suggests that that is the original timeline, and 2017 was always the original Judgment Day. Doesn't really help with the idea of who the CEO was, but I find that quite interesting. And so, with that, we come to a little look at the CEOs we do know about. We've established that Terminator Genisys is probably the closest that we get to 2018 having a CEO of Cyberdyne. And for all we know, it might have continued, and there might have been a kind of timeline, if you fudge it a little bit, where Dyson is the CEO. Boom, is the closest that we get. Does that mean that Game Night and Genesis take place in the same timeline? Anywho, let's look at the CEOs that we do know exist. The first real look at any sort of management or CEO, anything like that, comes in the original ending of the Terminator, which sees presumably a boss and another guy rooting around in the remnants of the Terminator after it's been crushed, and the police say no, and they say, oh, okay, sorry officer, but they've obviously got the CPU in their hands, and this leads to what we see in Terminator 2. And Cameron cut this scene for a couple of reasons. The main one was that he wasn't particularly impressed with the acting in the scene, but equally he felt it wasn't necessary to do something like that and sort of feed it to the audience about what's happening. But it was a whole kind of arc that, oh, they're in Cyberdyne, and this isn't something that's really that focused on in the theatrical release. And I really enjoy this scene. This is really cool. And what's nice about it is that's the first boss we get, the first characters that we see employed by Cyberdyne. What's nice about that is these characters were taken and ran with by Dark Horse Comics when they took over the license from Now in 1990. The other guy, the smaller guy who's working for the boss, became Ed Astin, notably similar to Austin, the name of the officer the T-1000 kills in Terminator 2. And he sort of ended up siding with Mary Randall, who was sent back in time. And Dark Horse very much wanted to really focus on these story beats that Terminator 2 had given us. So he ends up going sort of siding with the Resistance. And then we have the boss, who the comics took and called Bertram Hollister. And he ended up being this very greedy guy. He would do anything to make money. He ended up sort of very much the antagonist to Austin and the others. At some point he works with the Terminators that have been sent back, and and he's just not a particularly pleasant person. It's so there we go. So we have Hollister and Astin are these two characters, and the comics really use these characters to fill out their story beats. Notably, when we come to Frakes' novelization of T2, he also uses these characters in a completely different way. Ed Astin, instead of Ed Astin, we get Jack Kroll. And Jack Kroll, but he becomes ill and he dies, and he's replaced by Miles Dyson. This is why Miles Dyson gets his break. So it's really interesting. They go in completely different directions. But yeah, so Miles takes him over, and that's why Miles has the job that he has and the position that he has within the company. And then Frakes takes Bertram Hollister and makes him Greg Simmons, the CEO of Cyberdyne. And this is who we were talking about in regards to, obviously, Terminator 2 3D, and notably that he's this old, frail man, but he would live for years and make loads of more money. So perhaps Greg Simmons, Bertram Hollister would still be the CEO when we see the timeline Terminator 2 3D, but it doesn't matter because no way would he still be the CEO in 2018. And it's interesting in that Genesis, we have Dyson as CEO, which means Dyson presumably takes over from Simmons, which means Dyson actually took over from both Jack Kroll, Ed Astin, and Bertram Hollister, Greg Simmons. He's just hoovering up all the jobs at Cyberdyne. But Grayson Hunter still has a job. Dyson doesn't want that one. So we do see these characters. What happens to them? Obviously, for Frakes, they both, or whoever, they both die at some point. Astin quite young. Simmons would make loads more money before he dies. But obviously, in most of the continuities, Cyberdyne ends up not being a thing anymore. So he presumably goes and starts another company or joins another company and makes money another way. Unless we follow perhaps Genesis, which would see him being CEO, I assume, for longer, or T2 3D. Besides Simmons, Hollister, and Dyson, who is CEO obviously later, we do have another CEO. And the CEO is present in Sterling's Infiltrator novel from 2001. And this he treats this really interestingly. Page 7, we flash back to the aftermath of Terminator 2. Cyberdyne Systems Corporation parking lot, 1995. Good old S.M. Sterling. Paul Warren and Roger Colvin, respectively, president and CEO of Cyberdyne Systems. This is the only source, as far as I'm aware, that actually lists two kind of bosses, owners of Cyberdyne. We do have a CEO, Roger Colvin, and a president. It's always been a one-man system, and now we have two. President and CEO stood together in the cold, pre-dawn darkness and watched their company headquarters burn. So there's completely out of that continuity. You know, Dyson is kind of linked to others, to Hollister, Simmons. They have a kind of joint continuity. These two are completely out of that. They're just two completely other people, two different people. We don't really know much about them, but they are explored in the story. Have I finished this book? Obviously not, because I'm an idiot. But I do own all three of the series, and again, it's really exciting. I've still got things that I can look at. As far as I remember, the Terminator in this that goes back tries to kind of trick them in some way, seduce them in some way, or at least one of them, to forge Skynet's path ahead. So they do form part of the story. I have a feeling they both die, because why not? But there we are. So we actually have Roger Colbert, I think it said was the CEO. We have Simmons / Hollister, and we have Miles Dyson. These are the CEOs that we know about. In 2018, as I said, probably the most likely candidate would be Miles Dyson. I think the others all either die or just don't get quite close enough because of other things like Judgment Day happening. Awesome. Conclusion: in most timelines, there is no Cyberdyne at all in 2018. Closest we get is probably Genesis. That T, blimey, is Genesis, and Dyson comes closest, and probably at some point in some timeline would have been CEO in 2018. Not that guy.